Chapter 13 and 14. 13 has to do with physical health, and 14 has to do with mental health culturally. So let's go ahead and get started. Maybe. There we go. Genetic variability in humans is considerably less than in many other species, given how recently modern humans emerged as a species. Modern humans first emerged approximately 200,000 years ago, and they all lived in Africa until approximately 50 to 60,000 years ago, when some of them migrated elsewhere. What I read today. We are going through the hottest era in human history. So if you think it's hot outside, you're right. It's hotter than any human has ever experienced. Humans have become so dependent on cultural information to survive that culture has become a selective force on their biological nature. Humans are said to be a product of cultured gene coevolution, as they have both evolved biological predispositions to depend on cultural information. And this cultural information enhances their fitness as it continues to evolve. A common domain in which we see evidence for this selection is cultural differences in dietary practices, such as milk consumption. Different cultures vary in what they regularly eat, and long-term persistent changes in dietary practices have been accompanied by genetic evolution that maximizes the effectiveness of the nutrition that people derive from their diet. Humans vary in the amount of starch they eat. In general, people in agricultural societies consume more starch than those in most foraging societies. And the people from cultures in which a lot of starch has traditionally been consumed are more likely to have a genetic mutation that increases the amount of amylase protein in their saliva, which helps to digest starch. And this is according to research by Perry et al. In 2007. In West Africa, populations of Kwa-speaking farmers started to grow yam crops, which required them to clear the forests. One inadvertent side effect of this cultural practice was that it increased the amount of standing water after a rain, creating a better habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria then spread in these regions and led to the evolution of a particular genetic variant for hemoglobin that is associated with sickle cell anemia, which has the benefit of making one more resistant to developing malaria. Researchers around the world have attempted to identify different genetic variables that might lead to social sensitivity. 5-HTTLPR, A118G, and MAOA are alleles that have, MAOA is monoamine oxidase something, are alleles that have been found in Asian samples but not in European samples. Could they have something to do with social sensitivity? A genetic variant that is associated with increased emotional support seeking in times of distress for European Americans is associated with decreased emotional support seeking among Koreans. A variant that is associated with increased attention to foreground objects among European Americans shows the opposite effect among Koreans. A variant that leads to better responses to antidepressants among Caucasians leads to worse responses among Koreans and Japanese. A variant associated with decreased emotion suppression among European Americans predicted increased emotional expression among Koreans. Studies that included a sample of Korean Americans who are genetically more similar to Koreans but culturally more similar to European Americans, showed a pattern of results that were more similar to those of European Americans, demonstrating that cultural experiences can actually shape how genes are expressed in the body. Dutch men average 6'1", 3 inches taller than the average American man, who stands at just under 5'10". In 1865, American men averaged 5'8", which was 3 inches taller than the average Dutch man at the time. In the late 19th century, on average, Americans were among the tallest in the world, reflecting their relative advantage in income. Their gross national product per capita was third highest in the world. At that time, American men stood 1 inch taller than Britons, the same height as Australians, 2 inches taller than Norwegians, 3 inches taller than the French, 4 inches taller than Italians, and more than 7 inches taller than the Japanese. What happened last night? Oh, the United States women's team played against the Netherlands, the Dutch. And if you were watching the game from ground level, you noticed that every single Dutch player was taller than the American that they were playing against. It was really kind of interesting. The one small player on the Dutch team was the one that ran around the most and caused the most damage. But the Dutch were tall, very tall girls. Some of them were women. I'm sorry. Some of them were actually a whole head taller than the American women. South Korean children are about 5 inches taller than their North Korean counterparts. Japanese immigrants to California in the 1950s were about 5 inches taller than their compatriots in Japan. Dairy consumption in particular has been linked to height. And these are Japanese people in, Japanese guys in Hawaii at the turn of the 20th century. And as you can see, these Japanese individuals that have consumed food in the United States are almost a head taller than the Japanese from Japan, who eat a lot of rice and they also consume a lot of fish, but they don't drink a lot of milk. Japanese and Korean adults report sleeping about an hour less per day than French adults do. Moreover, these cultural differences are not just evident among adults. A systematic study of infants and toddlers in 17 countries around the world found that Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Infants from Asian countries were found to sleep much less than infants from Western countries. Dutch infants were found to sleep about 1.3 hours more than American infants. People in countries at the extreme of the sleep spectrum, Japan and the Netherlands, have a pronounced difference in the amount that they sleep. Japanese, European Canadians, and Asian Canadians were provided biometric measurements to measure their sleep. Japanese participants slept about 1.2 hours less than the 2 Canadian samples. Asian Canadians slept similarly to European Canadians, showing that it is cultural. Japanese participants indicated that their ideal amount of sleep was about an hour less than that reported by Canadians. The Canadians described themselves as feeling more tired during the day, even though they were sleeping more than the Japanese. Until recently, socioeconomic status was invisible to health researchers. Research in 1984 of English civil servants were divided into 4 class categories. The researchers found that compared with top administrators, members of the executive class were 60% more likely to die over the 10-year period. The clerical staff was 120% more likely to die, and the unskilled laborers were 170% more likely to die. Despite the fact that these are very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. It is actually larger than smokers and non-smokers. The same thing was observed in Denmark. The same thing was observed in Norway. And there's a reason why I have policemen up here, and the reason is because they are civil servants. The same thing was observed in Finland. The same thing was observed in France. The same thing was observed in Japan. The same thing was observed in New Zealand. In the United States, almost every increase in income reduces mortality rates, and these differences emerge even among those incomes at the highest level. And there you go, death rates by income level. The Fulani, Mosi, and the Remaib are all live in northeast Burkina Faso. And what did I find out about Burkina Faso? Burkina Faso is the native language, and it means Burkina Faso means the uncorruptible people. That's what it means. I just learned that in a book. The region is epidemic with malaria, which is a major cause of death in the area. The Mosi and the Ramaib have been living in this region for thousands of years and have developed much genetic resistance to malaria over time. The Fulani moved to this region in the early 19th century as part of the Islamic invasion of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fulani have not developed much genetic resistance to malaria. The Fulani are the dominant ethnic group in this area. When the Fulani first arrived, they conquered, enslaved, and decultured the other ethnic groups in the area, including the Mosi and Ramaib. The higher status that they have as conquerors appears to provide them with enough health benefits to more than make up for their genetic vulnerability to malaria. Your health may be seriously compromised if you don't have enough money to pay for adequate health care. In the British Civil Servants study, all of the workers had the same access to state-provided health care, yet there were still pronounced differences. People lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to have jobs that place them in hazardous situations, such as having to deal with poisonous toxins and that make them vulnerable to workplace accidents. People in the lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to smoke, eat a poor diet, and are less likely to exercise. Chronically stressed people are more likely to engage in health-compromising behaviors such as smoking and drinking in order to cope with their difficulties in their lives. And stress directly weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infections and manage other threats. People who feel that they do not have much control in their jobs tend to have a higher risk of heart disease. Low levels of control are more generally associated with poor physical functioning and an increased likelihood of illness. One study by Lockman and Weaver in 1998 found that although lower socioeconomic status people have worse health outcomes, those with lower socioeconomic status who felt that they had much control in their lives had levels of health and well-being that were comparable with those in higher income groups. So it has to do with control and feeling like you are in control. Stress and feelings of lack of control tend to be more pronounced among those who occupy a subordinate position and are subject to the demands of those who are able to make decisions for them. This is not just true of humans. Research with various primates has revealed that those individuals who are subordinate in a hierarchy experience greater stress hormone levels when the society is ruled by intimidation. The high stress hormones are especially true when subordinate primates are unable to easily avoid dominant individuals and when they have low availability of social support. The societal features that result in the greatest degree of stress among subordinates in various primate populations are remarkably similar to the situation in which many low socioeconomic status people find themselves in modernized industrialized societies. Feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. The experience of relative deprivation, of knowing that others are doing better than you, might lead to stress and its associated negative health consequences. There is a clear relation between the absolute wealth of a nation and the average life expectancy of its citizens. This is true up to the gross domestic product per capita figure of approximately $30,000 per year. Above the per capita gross domestic product $30,000, the curve largely flattens out, suggesting very little relation between absolute wealth and life expectancy. Many of the countries in the flat part of the curve have average incomes that are lower than that of the lowest Americans, yet these people don't seem to be worse off in terms of health outcomes. Poor Americans are doing far worse than wealthier Americans. Income and wealth is actually a relationship between wealth and one's income relative to those around you. Indians living in the poor province of Kerala have far lower absolute incomes than poor African Americans in the United States. However, people in Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree. The Keralians are poor in absolute terms, but they likely feel less poor because nearly everyone around them is poor. Poor Americans often earn an income that is not that poor by international standards. However, they are poor compared to their fellow Americans, and their health suffers accordingly. Disadvantaged minorities around the world tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, and they often experience worse health outcomes than those with majority members. In particular, African Americans in the United States suffer from relatively worse health outcomes. Looking at the 15 leading causes of death in the United States, African Americans have higher death rates than that of European Americans for 12 of them. African Americans tend to be of much lower socioeconomic status than European Americans. Many of the reasons for their higher mortality can likely be explained by the socioeconomic status difference. The three that there are 15 here. The three that they don't have is respiratory disease, Alzheimer's disease, and suicide. That's higher in white Americans. Infant mortality rates among African Americans are about double that of European Americans, and these differences also hold for those African Americans who are highly educated. Hypertension is especially high among African American men, and unlike other health outcomes, hypertension rates are slightly higher for African American men with college degrees than they are for African American men with less education. The opposite holds true for African American women and for European American men and women. Compared to European Americans, Latinos tend to have a lower mortality rate for the 10 of the 15 causes of death. This ethnic difference is all the more puzzling because Latinos tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than European Americans, and hence should be expected to suffer worse health outcomes. Epidemiological paradox. The epidemiological paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans, and there are no explanations why. Latinos tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latinos, although they also tend to exercise less. The longer they have lived in the United States, the more likely they are to engage in unhealthy behaviors as they come to drink more, smoke more, and are more likely to become obese. Some cultural factors are more pronounced among Latinos, such as the high value placed on childbearing, and a good deal of emotional support provided by the communities seem to provide an important health buffer. Latinos derive health benefits from cultural groups such as simpatica and their unusually high levels of positive affect. In traditional non-Western societies, beliefs in supernatural causes of illness are widespread. These range from theories that aggressive spirits, such as ghosts, cause disease, which is the most widespread theory of disease, to accounts of witchcraft, sorcery, mystical retributions, and sinful violations of taboos. Among the Azande of West Africa, the primary cause of illness is attributed to witchcraft. Some Zandi are believed to be witches, and the source of their witchcraft is believed to be a small organ in their bodies, which can be inherited from their parents. The Zandi witches do not perform any rites, use any potions, or cast any spells. Rather, witches conduct their witchcraft entirely through their minds and their eyes. And you can see this lady's eyes. You can see this lady's eyes. When a Zandi develops a slowly progressing illness, it is believed to be the result of a witch who is consuming the soul of its victim's organs a little bit at a time. When a Zandi develops a sudden acute illness, it is believed to be the result of a sorcerer casting a spell on them. In traditional Chinese medicine, a healthy body is one in which the dialectical forces of yin and yang are in balance. Any imbalances are believed to ultimately lead to illness. A person who has liver fire will have symptoms such as headaches, flushed face, and anger, and this illness is believed to be caused by having too much yang and not enough yin. Such an imbalance can be corrected by acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle. Western doctors often disagree with one another. There are rather striking differences between medical practices of French and American doctors. French believe in a concept of terrain, or balance. These emphasis on balance shifts drug consumption away from antibiotics and toward various tonics and vitamins that are believed to strengthen the immune system. Long rests and spa visits are also viewed as an important part of the lifestyle that rejuvenates the terrain. Hospital stays are relatively long in France, about double the length of the United States, for the same purpose. For the same procedures, to provide ample time for recuperation. That's the only reason you'd be admitted into the hospital if you needed help recovering from your illness. French hospitals are notorious for employing clowns to raise the spirits of their patients. This is an ancient practice dating back to the ancient Greeks. French clowns are especially common in pediatric wings. When Europeans first came to the Americas, the natives often commented on how badly they smelled. This is because of the common medical practice in the 17th century in France stated that bodily secretions offered a layer of protection, so it was considered unhealthy to bathe frequently. A 1976 article of Le Monde, a French magazine, stated that the French hospital patient had the right to a monthly bath and a weekly foot washing. French dermatologists recommend that people, even those with oily hair, not wash their hair more than once a week because doing so causes a greater amount of oil to be secreted. The metaphor used in the United States by doctors is that the body is like a machine that needs to be tended to regularly to ensure that it is running well. When there are problems with the body, it is often treated in ways that you might expect to see a machine treated. U.S. medicine is known as the most aggressive in the world. Surgical procedures are used far more in the United States than in other countries, where malfunctioning parts are removed, replaced, and or physically altered. U.S. doctors are more likely than European doctors to use surgery rather than drugs, and when drugs are prescribed in the United States, they are prescribed at higher doses than any other country. It is rare in the United States for a doctor to prescribe rest and relaxation as a curative agent. U.S. doctors tend to search for external causes of illness, such as bacteria and viruses. U.S. doctors prescribe more antibiotics than doctors from elsewhere, and Americans tend to have a greater concern for cleanliness and attempt to avoid contact with germs. And that is the end of chapter 13. So now chapter 14, this is the last chapter. What counts as a disorder? Chapter 14. I'm going too slow. Psychological disorders are defined as rare behaviors that somehow impair the individual. What type of impairment is problematic, and what if a behavior that is rare in one context is not rare in another? Indeed, some psychopathologies are more prevalent or manifest in highly different forms across cultures. Experiencing a culture-bound syndrome generally requires one to have cultural beliefs associated with the syndrome. DHAT, is a morbid anxiety seen most frequently among South Asian males that they are losing or leaking semen, and it is believed that loss of sperm results in the person getting seriously ill. This often results from anxieties about disapproved sexual acts such as masturbation. This dot would be a meaningless label in the United States. However, where there are no cultural beliefs about the vitality that sperm endows and no cultural beliefs about the consequences of the loss of sperm, it is possible that other cultures differ from the same psychological disorders as the West, but don't have the same cultural beliefs associated with Western diagnoses, including them. Meaningless in other cultural contexts. Hikikomori is a condition in Japan characterized by living in an asocial state with no intimate relationships with anyone outside of the immediate family. Now you got to remember, Japan is a very crowded place. It's a very collectivistic place. So if you've got an individual that's staying by themselves that are asocial, they're going to be labeled as having a mental illness, and that mental illness is often hikikomori. First appears in junior high, and then they end up reading books, watching TV, or playing games in their room. That sounds horrible. Indications are that the cause may be failure to succeed in the social world that has few options for those who don't fit in. Does not conform to criteria for any of the DSM-5 diagnoses. It has only recently become a cultural phenomenon and is now seen, although rarely, in other East Asian countries. So where would it be seen? It would be seen in portions of China and Korea. Approximately one child per classroom in junior high and high school is afflicted with hikikomori, largely not existent in pre-war Japan and uncommon in other cultures. And there you go. Somebody that isolates themselves so much that they missed their graduation. Looks like they missed their clothes. Bulimia nervosa. Bulimia is uncontrollable binge eating. Individuals then take inappropriate measures to prevent weight gain. Absent in most cultures of the world, making it a culture-bound syndrome, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. Eating disorders affect many people in the West, but there are some nuances when it comes to determining universality of these conditions. Bulimia appears to be a culture-bound syndrome because rates have increased over time, and the age of the people being diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. It is also more prevalent in some societies, particularly those with Western influences, than others. In particular, it is absent in most cultures of the world, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. There is good evidence that bulimia is a culture-bound syndrome. Anorexia nervosa, an individual's refusal to maintain normal body weight due to preoccupation with their bodies. Evidence of culture-bound status, huge increase in rates of anorexia this century, primarily found in only some cultures. Evidence of universality, reports of self-starvation in numerous cultural contexts, but not due to body image. As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. However, it has been found in cultures that have very little Western influence, and it also manifests differently in some other contexts as well. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted among ascetics who refused food for religious reasons, and in the 17th and 18th century among teenage girls who starved themselves to model themselves after the ascetics. This historical record of anorexia, as well as evidence of anorexia in many non-Western contexts, have led some to argue that it is a universal disorder, although it may serve different functions in different places. For example, religious reasons versus weight loss reasons. This is Mahatma Gandhi. He wanted to show his strength, and one of the ways he showed his strength was by sleeping with young girls and not responding to them. That was part of his strength. It was not responding to young girls. He was married and he had children, of course, but he didn't veer from his strength. Koro is a morbid anxiety about one's penis shrinking into one's body. Primarily found in South and East Asia, it is unclear what aspects of culture have led to the emergence of Koro. Koro-like symptoms have been found in some individuals in West African cultures, as well as in individuals in American culture who have had negative marijuana-induced experiences. Amok is an acute outburst of unrestrained violence and homicidal attacks preceded by brooding, followed by exhaustion and amnesia. Most common in Southeast Asia, it may result from having no acceptable means to express one's frustration. Hysteria is a commonly diagnosed condition in the 19th century Europe among women. Symptoms include temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite for food and sex. Rates of hysteria diagnosis dropped dramatically in the early 20th century. Some think this is due to being replaced by other diagnostic categories, while others think it was associated with repressive Victorian cultural norms. Sexual repression was very common, and that may be one of the reasons why Freud came up with some of his diagnoses, because the sexual repression of the time was quite acute. Phrygophobia is a morbid fear of catching cold. It's found largely in China. People avoid cold air, eating cold food, dress with several layers. This disorder has been linked to other psychological disorders, such as hypochondriasis and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Phrygophobia may be culturally linked to Koro, where that disorder causes male sufferers to feel that their penis is retracting into their body due to an insufficiency of male element, or yang. Male phrygophobia sufferers correlate coldness with an overabundance of female element, or yin. This looks like a person standing at the window. This is an icicle. It formed like that. Susto, a frightening condition in which a person thinks their soul has been caused to become dislodged from their body, causing a variety of other physical and psychological symptoms. It's primarily found in Latin America. Voodoo death, a person is convinced a curse has been placed on him or her, or she has broken a taboo. Results in severe fear reaction, which may lead to death. It's mostly found in Africa, but it's also found in the Caribbean and in New Orleans. Lata is a transient dissociated state brought on by a startling event, followed by engaging in cultural inappropriate behavior, after which the person has no memory or of the episode. Found primarily in Southeast Asia, but also in Siberia and amongst the Ainu in Japan. Malgri is a concern that one has been invaded by totemic spirit, a totemic spirit, that makes them sick, tired, and drowsy because they entered the sea or a new territory without having engaged in the appropriate ceremonial rituals. It's identified among Aboriginal Australians, and of course, this is very important to them. Agonius is an anxiety disorder that includes a burning sensation, loss of breath, and sleeping, among other symptoms. It's primarily found in Portugal and the Azores. And of course, the Azores are islands off the coast of Africa that belong to Portugal. Kufungisis is an anxiety and somatic problems associated with mental exhaustion stemming from too much thinking, primarily found in Africa, Caribbean, among Native Americans, and East Asia. Kufungusisa. There you go. It's thinking too much. And what do I try to make you do? I try to make you think. Oh, what a villain I am. Attaque des nervois, feeling palpitations, numbness, and a rising heat sensation during emotionally charged situations, such as funerals. It has been found in Puerto Rico. Attack of the nerves. Universal syndromes highlight the biological bases of these psychopathologies. Still, prevalence and manifestations of these disorders may differ across cultures. The DSM-5, the major depressive disorder, MDD, as diagnosed, giving 5 of the following 9 symptoms: depressed mood, inability to feel pleasure, change in weight or appetite, sleep problems, psychomotor change, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless or guilty, poor concentration, suicidality. So suicidality. So if you have any 5 of these 9, then potentially you have major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder has been found in all cultures that people have studied. Prevalence rates appear to vary. Depression prevalence rates vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. The rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the West. One proposed rationale for this is due to 2 different manifestations of symptoms. Somatization is the symptoms are primarily physiological, such as loss of appetite. Psychologization is symptoms are primarily psychological, such as depressed mood. I have no idea why I put the mountain lion there. Many Chinese psychiatric patients are diagnosed with neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, inability to concentrate. Neurasthenia was dropped from the DSM because symptoms were more physiological than psychological. Some have argued that most Chinese neurasthenia actually qualifies for depression, even if only 9% of them report feeling depressed. Social anxiety disorder is a fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, leading to negative social consequences. Research has shown that East Asians exhibit more social anxiety symptoms than European Americans. Accordingly, evidence suggests that interdependence is associated with heightened social anxiety. However, social anxiety is less documented in East Asian countries. And I've seen this before. In Mississippi, the guy that took over the mental hospital, state mental hospital, was an expert in schizophrenia. So guess what? Everybody that came in to his hospital were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Across the state, there was another state hospital, and that guy was he concentrated on bipolar disorder. And by golly, everybody that went into that place was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Now, the interesting thing was, one was more of a white hospital, and the other was more of a black hospital, as bizarre as that is. So if you were black, you were sent to the hospital for schizophrenia. And if you were white, you were sent to the hospital for, this is back in the 90s, in the hospital for bipolar disorder. And if they got it wrong, then they would, if you didn't respond to the medication, then they would send you to the other hospital. But it didn't really integrate things hardly at all. It has been documented universally, but counterintuitively, it is less documented in East Asian countries than in North American countries, despite greater concerns about social harmony and maintaining faith in East Asia. Certainly, East Asians exhibit greater social anxiety symptoms, and there is some link between interdependence and social anxiety symptoms. In general, though, the rates of social anxiety disorder in North America and Europe are 14 times higher than rates in East Asia. The paradox between East Asians experiencing more symptoms but not meeting clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder may be due to differences in what behaviors are considered culturally normative. In Western cultures, the norm is for people to be extroverted. In East Asian cultures, the norm is for people to be introverted. That's not to say that social anxieties do not become a problem in East Asian cultures. There is a culture-bound disorder called Taijin Kaiyu Fushu, or a fear of confronting others. It is a fear that is solicited by social situations such that one is concerned about how uncomfortable one makes other people feel, perhaps because of their gaze, your body odor, or the fact that you're sweating. It is similar to social anxiety disorder because it is effectively treated using the same antidepressant as is used to treat social anxiety disorder. It has thus far been limited to Japan, China, and South Korea. Suicide rates vary dramatically around the world. Eastern Europe tends to have the highest rates. Muslim nations tend to have the lowest rates. Suicide rates also vary depending on one's age, with the elderly generally being more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. There is a special case in Micronesia in which there is a spike in the adolescent age group. This started primarily in the 1970s when a spate of suicides occurred among adolescent men over seemingly trivial problems with no obvious psychological issues to begin with. These suicides were also restricted to specific islands, particularly the suburban regions of those islands. Some have suggested that this spike was due to westernization of the islands, leading to a loss of traditional roles for young men. And there you go. Losing connection between one's cultural narrative and modern society, lack of cultural continuity, seems to put people at risk for suicide. Many First Nations bands do not have a strong sense of cultural continuity due to Western colonization. Many youths cannot identify with their traditional culture and are also unable to identify with mainstream Canadian culture. Support for this argument has come from findings that bands with stable connections or traditional cultural past have lower suicide rates. Such a connection is indicated by negotiating a land claim with the government, possessing self-government, maintaining control over educational services, controlling your police and fire services, managing health services, and cultural facilities. The more these indicators are present, the lower the suicide rate. One fundamental hypothesis that researchers have found support for is that the lack of connection to one's cultural roots is a strong predictor of suicide rates. This is compounded by the fact that many do not identify with the mainstream Canadian culture. Indeed, research has found that the more that First Nations communities can connect with their cultural heritage, history, the lower their suicide rates are. The communities that have the most number of connections have suicide rates that are comparable with those of mainstream Canada. Those connections include having its own policing or law enforcement organization, cultural facilities that promote a community's cultural history, having one's own political job, and perhaps or not, a community is negotiating a claim to territorial land. Despite the universal prevalence of suicides, prevalence rates still differ dramatically across cultures. Motivations for suicide also vary greatly across cultures. Motivations in the West usually include substance abuse or depression. Motivations in Japan often deal with one accepting responsibility and or preserving honor. The cases of the First Nation and Micronesia suggest that different cultures have different motivations for suicide, and it may carry different meaning in different cultures. For instance, Japan has a long history of suicide, playing an unusually significant role with the ritualized suicide method of seppuku, and this is seppuku right here. Theoretically, he stabbed himself with his long sword, but they normally don't do that. That's beside him. And of course, he's going to use the gun to shoot with. The long sword is used to behead the individual. They have a short sword for gutting yourself, and that's what you do. You gut yourself, and then you have a friend that chops your head off. And the reason they do that is because it's very painful to have a stomach wound like that. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating mental disorders and universally found around the world. There are relevant genetic factors, prenatal experiences, and neuroanatomical features diagnosed given two or more of the following: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, negative symptoms, catatonic behavior. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating. Oh, we've already said that. Schizophrenia is a disorder that is diagnosed when one exhibits two or more of these symptoms: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, catatonic or grossly disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms such as flat affect or loss of speech. There is good evidence of a genetic component for schizophrenia. One's likelihood of developing schizophrenia increases as the degree of genetic relatedness with someone who has schizophrenia increases. Despite its biological basis and similar incidence rates across cultures, some cultural variation still exists. That is, only 1% of general population will develop schizophrenia. Having a cousin with the disorder leads to a likelihood of 2% of 2%. Having a sibling with schizophrenia increases the likelihood to 9%, and having an identical twin increases the likelihood to 48%. As one would expect with something that has a biological basis, incidence and prevalence rates are quite similar across different cultures. But notice that, despite the role of genetics, there is still more than a 50% chance that someone would not develop schizophrenia even if their identical twin with whom one shares 100% of your genes has schizophrenia. Subtypes of schizophrenia vary substantially. In the West, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is as high as 75%, and the rate of catatonic schizophrenia is somewhere between 1 and 3%. In India, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is as high as 15%, but the rate of catatonic schizophrenia is 20%. Also, patients in less developed societies have greater rate of recovery than in more industrialized societies, as weird as that sounds. This is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental pathologies. The cause of this difference is unknown. Some suggest that patients are more likely to remain members of a community in such societies rather than become homeless in industrialized societies. Interestingly, patients in less developed societies have greater rates of recovery from schizophrenia than in more industrialized societies, which is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental conditions. Explanations for this counterintuitive pattern include laying less blame on the patient due to his or her having less of a primary sense of control, having more positive associations with what the West considers to be hallucinations, and greater involvement of the community so that the person does not get left alone. Just as presentation and prevalence of psychological disorders vary across cultures, the same goes for how the disorders are treated. There is a tradition in the West of patients seeing a therapist and verbalizing their feelings and problems. Likely rooted in the Western emphasis on self-expression and being in a low-context culture, among many other ideas discussed in this course, there is cultural variation in coping and seeking support. East Asians are less likely than European Americans to actively seek social support. This is due to the concerns about how this will disrupt relationships with others. Instead, they rely on implicit social support, reminding themselves of the close relationship that they have. This may explain why East Asians tend to seek professional mental health treatment less than Westerners. Western treatment traditions can be traced back to Freudian times. Psychological problems are best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences. As treatment has extended into modern times, there is an emphasis on understanding the individual, his/her self-discovery, and his/her cognitive biases. Freud thought that psychological problems were best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences because such problems were believed to be rooted in people's conflicts at an unconscious level, and the therapist should then interpret those experiences and memories. Carl Rogers then introduced the client-centered approach, and other biological modes of thought have since developed as well. But the common thread running through all the different therapy options is the client's ability to engage with the therapist. In contrast to the Western style, two broad categories of treatments can be seen elsewhere. Family-centered, families seen as a key source of guidance and play an important role in treatment, and spiritualism and religion, construing psychological disorders as a problem with one's spirituality or relationship with God or gods that went awry. And this is a seance back, looks like it's before World War I, but spiritualism was very popular after World War I. In other cultures, healing practices are performed very differently. One of the most common practices is the role of families. They share the problems with the individual and also share the stigma and blame associated with whatever mental illness the individual has. Another common practice involves spiritualism and religion, which incorporates traditional healers such as shamans and sorcerers. Japan also has a couple of unique approaches to psychotherapy that reflects the cultural inclinations of Japan. The two are called Morita therapy and Nikan therapy. Morita therapy is used to treat depression and anxiety symptoms. It does so by emphasizing secondary control, asking clients to accept the circumstances of their lives. The client must change their perspectives of the symptoms and learn to live productively in spite of these symptoms. To live productive lives, the treatment plan involves light manual activities such as sweeping, heavy manual labor such as chopping wood, and other forms of life training. Niken therapy is used to treat people with depression and addiction problems. Clients are asked to reflect on their past, particularly in the kindnesses that they have received from others, while thinking about how little they have offered in return for those kindnesses. Given the cultural diversity and prevalence rates of psychopathologies, one concern that has been raised is whether Western mental health treatments may sometimes do more harm than good. For instance, it's been argued that anorexia did not exist in the same form in Hong Kong until it was imported there. Similarly, post-traumatic stress disorder was not a big problem in Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami until Western aid workers insisted that they must suffer from it. There you go. And that is the end of the chapter. Sorry, I almost fell asleep a couple times. Not exactly sure why. I guess I didn't get enough sleep last night. I had a good time this semester. Turn in all your stuff. I have to be in by the 4th. And I will talk to you later.